Okay. So we left off on Friday, right? Talking about how we make your muscles bigger. And so I showed you guys the data that basically most of you can make most of your muscles somewhere between maybe 10 and 20% bigger on average. Some of you never gonna get bigger. I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. Some of you look at a weight room and you get jacked, like good for you. Okay. But we were getting into a little bit of the what actually happens at the protein level, at the cellular level, that will drive how your muscles get bigger. Okay. And we started talking about this idea of protein synthesis, which I'm sure you guys have had before. And I'm not going to go through step by step by step by step by step again. But you have genes in the nucleus of every one of your cells that will code for actin and myosin, all of the other necessary skeletal muscle proteins. Okay. So what we need to do when we exercise is do something that provides a stimulus to tell those genes to make messenger RNA, have that messenger RNA, okay, go to a ribosome. So making DNA to RNA for those proteins is called transcription. And then taking those messenger RNA and making them into actual actin, myosin, titin, all the other connective tissue, that's called translation. Okay. Activate the genes, transcribe them into messenger RNA, and then translate that messenger RNA into the proteins. And so when you go and work out, when you resistance train, this is what's going to happen. And it's going to happen, right? And it's going to stay that way. Those genes will stay turned on for a day or two, maybe at most. And then they will turn back off again. Right? So then what you need to be able to do is I worked out today, I get a little bit of extra protein because of this, right? It stays up through tomorrow. Then on Wednesday, I probably need to go work out again, right? And then I need to go work out again on Friday, and then Sunday, right? Et cetera, et cetera. You've got to put yourself into a place where this process is happening on more days than not, okay? On more days than not. And you put yourself in what we call a positive protein balance, right? A situation where protein synthesis predominates over protein degradation on a majority of days. And then over time, over weeks or months, then eventually enough protein is made that it gets put into your muscles and they get bigger. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? Like that's the general idea. And I finished on Friday talking about that in some instances, depending upon what you eat and what you do, this acute response, this I squatted today, then I ate some protein, my transcription and translation goes up 200% or something ridiculous today, right? But if I work out consistently for months on end, I'm not going to get 200% bigger muscles. So there's a little bit of a disconnect, okay? Anybody go look at your protein powder at home and see if it was advertising like, take this at so many grams, you eat 200 grams of protein a day, will increase your protein synthesis rates by some number? They're very prone to doing that. They always present the acute numbers and never the, yeah, they're getting an extra 1% over 12 weeks in muscle size, which is mostly what the literature tells us. And I think I had told you guys, we'll see with all of this before. Do I have anybody want to admit to being a vegetarian? Any vegetarians in class? None? Then none of you need a protein supplement. None. Okay, none. If you eat a normal, regular American diet, the vast majority of you guys get plenty of protein. You take a protein supplement, doesn't hurt you, but you just have expensive feed. Right? You excrete out all the extra amino acids. Okay. If you're an Olympian, maybe it matters. Maybe that extra 1% or 2% really matters. But for most of you guys, you're fine, right? Go eat a cheeseburger. You're gonna be okay, right? Have a piece of chicken, have a piece of steak, have a piece of fish, something, eat some peanut butter, you're gonna be fine. Okay. you're going to be fine. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more mechanistically about what's going on. Okay, so your proteins are always either gaining or losing. They're always in this constant state of flux. Okay, reminds me of the sort of the guilt trip that my dad used to give all of us. He was a football coach, right? About you're either going to get better today or you're going to get worse today. You're never going to stay the same. I'm scarred from that for life in some ways on all of these things. But that's what's happening in your muscles. Either they're getting bigger or they're getting smaller, right? They're never ever really staying the same. Okay. And so what we want to do to make them bigger is we need to tip that balance, that net protein synthesis towards positive. That gets us hypertrophy. If you're in a negative balance, you get atrophy. Your muscles will shrink because we want those proteins for someplace else in the body. And so because of that, you will pull them out of muscle and use them elsewhere. Okay. How do we regulate protein balance? It's very complicated. There are hundreds of signals. Okay. It's related to anabolic and catabolic hormones. Diet plays some role, right? Not just diet composition, but the total amount of food that you're eating, the kind of net mechanical loading situation in your muscles, stretching of muscles, which we'll talk about, metabolic stress, nervous system activity, and then I put question mark because there's other things that we don't fully know. Okay? It's very complicated. It's very complicated. We're going to talk about a few of the things, but not all of them. A state of anabolism, okay, is an increase in the rate of protein synthesis. A state of catabolism is when you have increased degradation. You're always degrading some proteins, you're always increasing other proteins. And what we're looking at is what is the net balance between those two things? Okay, what is the net balance between them? So here, as I was telling you guys, here are some data. Okay, this is from using radio-labeled amino acids that we infuse into people. And then these are from the University of Texas Medical Center at Galveston, which has probably the leading researchers in protein synthesis rates in the entire world. They run an arterial and a venous femoral catheters. Okay, here. I, for one, am not volunteering for a femoral artery catheter because if they mess that shit up, you can bleed out real quick. But they do these, they infuse you with these radioactive or radio-labeled proteins. You work out, and then you just sit there in a bed for like 3 days. And you eat, right? And then they just take samples, they pull out biopsies, and they look at these things. And so what you can see here, this is something called myofibrillar protein. FSR stands for fractional synthesis rate. This is how we try to quantify amino acids being put into muscle. Okay, here's your resting level of fractional synthesis rate. Don't worry about what those numbers are, right? But what you want to see is that 6 hours after about a resistance training, you see that it's up. 24 hours, it's up a little bit more. It's still up at 48 hours, and it's still up at 72 hours. So you work out today, and you can potentially drive increases in synthesis rates in the muscles that you worked out for about 3 days. Okay, for about 3 days. Give or take. Okay. If you eat a high protein diet, just eat some protein here for breakfast, it can elevate your synthesis rates for about 24 hours. Okay. So resistance training gets you more than simply eating. We know if you resistance train and you eat a relatively high amount of protein, which most people do, okay, you can bump these rates a little bit, okay, a little bit more. If you resistance train, you eat a high protein meal and you have some carbohydrates all at the same time, you get a little bit bigger one, even on top of all of that. The carbs drive the secretion of insulin, which is also anabolic, and it helps to increase the synthesis rates a little bit as well. Okay, so if you read stuff, you get on, see some kind of TikTok video, you go on a blog and talking about, okay, there's this period of time afterwards where you need to eat, and you should eat this, or you want to buy some kind of a supplement, you go to GNC, and you buy, I don't know, muscle milk or some other sorts of things, right? You're gonna pay like $4 for a little thing, and all it is basically is chocolate milk, right? Chocolate milk has like the exact right ratio of carbs to protein. You guys may ask, does casein matter, right, versus whey protein versus other forms of protein? And the answer is a tiny little bit, but generally no, not that much. Protein is protein is protein. And so most of it is, as long as it has leucine in it, most of it's pretty good. Okay. All right. So what I've told you guys up to now is, right, from Friday, you have a muscle fiber, you exercise it, you eat some protein, that fiber gets bigger, okay? That is what we think the best evidence tells us as far as how we hypertrophy and muscles get bigger, okay? There is another possibility that we don't think happens in people, but I want to present it to you guys, okay? And there's this idea of something that we call hyperplasia. Hyperplasia would mean you have one fiber, right? And instead of that one fiber getting bigger, what happens is one fiber becomes two. And then two fibers become four, okay? So it's an idea of fiber splitting or an idea of fiber multiplication, like it's mitosis or something, like cells would multiply in that way. It is next to impossible for us to quantify in you all, okay? I can take a biopsy from you all, count how many fibers are there, have you resistance train, mark where I went in, and then go in and try to take another biopsy from the same place and count the fibers again, and we still aren't going to have any idea because it's not the same muscle or the exact same fibers potentially, right? It's hard for us to know things. To do this, I would have to like pull your entire muscle out, count all the fibers, put them back together, put your muscle back in, right? And then it's completely infeasible, okay? We do know from doing this in animal models, though, in cats and rats and mice and things where you can just kill the animal and some poor grad student counts all the fibers, that under some circumstances, this does happen in lower animals, okay? And so here's some things that we have. This is called mechanical overload. What they do in animal models, if they want to make a muscle bigger, is they would go in, like let's just say you take your bicep and they cut the bicep tendon, and then they stretch it out. So they would cut it and then stretch it down closer to your wrist so the muscle exists at a more stretched length while you just go about your day. If we do that, your muscles get huge, okay? They get huge. And then they have them do some other kind of exercise. Oftentimes in those animal models, it's like run uphill or something like that. And then they have their sort of control kind of ways of doing things. And what they can see is that when we do this stretching model, there does seem to be some fiber splitting that takes place. Okay. We don't normally work out that way or do those things in humans, so we don't think hyperplasia plays a particularly sort of large role. It may if you take steroids. There's a little bit of evidence. It may if you take steroids play some role. Okay. So I just want to present this to you guys. It's just an idea. Okay. So what we generally think is this. You have four fibers, those four fibers get bigger. Okay. You can see the myonuclei, right? You've got your mini nuclei that are going to be in there, right? Fibers are these giant cells. You need many nuclei so you can turn on lots of genes and make lots of actin and myosin protein to put in. Okay. One of the things that we think may be a genetic reason why some people hypertrophy more than others is if you have more small muscle fibers to start with in your muscle, right? If you can't get new fibers, but you've got a bunch and they're all really small at rest, then you may have more capacity to be able to increase size of those individual fibers and therefore the size of your muscle. You might be a person that has fewer fibers and they're already pretty big, then there's only so big that they can get because of our surface area to volume. Okay, so this is what we are pretty sure. We know this does happen in people. We don't think fiber splitting really ever happens. Okay, that's sort of our goal. Okay, now, are y'all ready? We did cognition to contraction. Y'all wanna do this one on the next test? No? Come on. Right? I love a good signaling pathway. Okay. What we have here, and it's almost 15 years old, so it's infinitely more complicated now. Okay, is a map of all of the potential signals, cellular signals that we think may play some role in controlling protein synthesis. Okay, you look at the top, you can see muscle contractions, insulin, IGF-1 stands for insulin-like growth factor. It's talking about leucine, myostatin, and all these other different things. And there's all of these cellular signals that are going to go on. What I want you guys to know is very simple. I want you guys to know that thing right there in the red box. Okay, the primary hub. All of these signals eventually end up here. Okay, the cellular signal, the thing we need to activate to regulate and make your muscles get bigger is something called mTOR. Okay, mTOR. mTOR stands for the molecular target of rapamycin. Rapamycin is an antibiotic. Okay. So we named this because it's a place that the antibiotic rapamycin will bind. Why did it ever occur to anybody to convey the muscle fiber in rapamycin? I don't know. Okay, I don't know. But that's what this stands for. Okay, if you want your muscles to get bigger, you need to activate mTOR. You need to activate mTOR. If I give you testosterone, it activates mTOR. You resistance train, it activates mTOR. If I feed you protein, it activates mTOR. Okay. So this is the big deal. mTOR is the thing. Okay. There's an upstream thing of mTOR called AKT. That's pretty important. There's this downstream effector that's going to actually go into the nucleus and do things called P70S6 kinase. That's also super duper important. But that's the big deal. Okay. We need to activate mTOR. I want you to know mTOR. One of the cool things about mTOR is that one of the researchers that was one of the first to do anything with mTOR works in Oklahoma City. She works at OMRF now in Oklahoma City. Her name is Sue Bodine. And she's a huge deal. But she studies aging now, but is a big into the things that drive muscle hypertrophy. Okay. So we need to activate mTOR to get protein synthesis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some of the things that we could do to make that happen. Okay. One of those things is hormones. Okay. It's hormones. And I don't want to overplay, okay, the role of these hormones, because in a lot of instances, for most of you guys, what we need is you just need the hormones. Okay. You need them to be there just for proper function. We don't necessarily, we know if we supplement the hormones, in a lot of people, you'll get bigger muscles. We know if we inhibit the hormones or you lack the hormones, you blunt the muscle growth or you can't get muscle growth. Okay. But the exact response of these hormones after eating or after a bout of resistance training is less important. Okay. You really just need them. If I work out, and Campbell works out, and Hattie works out, and one of us gets more of a testosterone response after exercise than the others, you might think that that person would get the biggest increase in protein synthesis and have the best chance to make their muscles bigger, and that's not true. Okay? That's not true. You just need these hormones. So the first one is testosterone. Okay? Very simple, right? Male androgen hormone, right? I give you testosterone, you release testosterone. One of its primary roles is to drive protein synthesis. Okay. What we know about testosterone's role is if we give a physiological dose in what we call hypogonadal men, so men that do not produce enough testosterone, if we supplement them back to a normal age-appropriate physiological level, they get about a 15% increase in muscle mass. Okay, that comes from about a 55% increase in protein synthesis. Remember, I told you guys Friday and today that the increase in synthesis rate does not exactly match to how much we're actually going to get from a bigger muscle stem. Okay, if we supplement in eugonadal men, so men that make testosterone, you take extra, do nothing, 5 to 20% increase in muscle mass. Take testosterone, sit on the couch, get big, or get as big as most people get doing perfect resistance training. When you combine that supplement of extra testosterone with resistance training, we don't know how big you get. Absolutely ginormous. Okay. Now, ladies, most of you all make some testosterone. Not a huge amount, but some. Okay. And there's some variation. We know that women can increase muscle mass to basically the same extent as men. Okay. So use that as your grain of salt of how important is testosterone. Like, we know if we give you extra, it really works, but you just kind of need your normal physiological amount, whatever you have, to usually help trigger things. Okay. Growth hormone. I give you or you release testosterone. Testosterone stimulates the anterior pituitary to make growth hormone. Okay. So they're linked, but growth hormone drives protein synthesis, it drives the synthesis of bone and connective tissue and a bunch of other things, okay? We know if we supplement growth hormone, you get an increase in muscle mass, strength, protein synthesis. It also helps to decrease protein breakdown, okay? When you supplement growth hormone with training, it doesn't work like testosterone, okay? You do not get additional gains in muscle size taking growth hormone and training like you do with testosterone. What you do see, though, is when you take more growth hormone, is it seems to promote the breakdown of adipose tissue, more so than testosterone does, okay? So you take growth hormone, and you're going to get some increase in muscle mass, but you're also going to potentially sort of lose some extra body fat. The other issue with growth hormone, it's hard to delineate all of the effects of growth hormone from testosterone because testosterone causes it to be released. Growth hormone causes the release of the hormones on the bottom, something called IGF-1, or insulin-like growth factor 1. And so it's hard for us to tease out the differences between these things because one regulates the other. Okay. Okay. So the bottom, IGF-1 and then something called MGF. IGF-1 is a hormone that looks a lot like insulin, hence its name. It binds to receptors that look like the insulin receptor. Okay. It is not insulin. You make IGF-1 in the liver, and you make two kinds of IGF-1 in your muscles. Okay. So there is regular IGF-1, which is liver derived, and then that is also made by the muscles. Then there's this special muscle-only flavor of IGF-1. The official variant is called IGF-1 E(c), but we collectively refer to this variant as mechano growth factor, or MGF. It's only made in your muscles, okay? IGF-1 is important. MGF in some ways is even more important, okay? IGF-1 and MGF are oftentimes going to function in a role we call it's an autocrine. Anybody remember what an autocrine is or an autocrine does? To be endocrine, you get released and you go where? To the bloodstream. Good. Okay. To be a paracrine, you get released and you go where? Better remember? If you're a paracrine, you're going to get released and you're going to smack your neighbor in the head, right? You get taken up and used in tissue adjacent to where you are. Endocrine, you're going to get released and go into the back of the room or some other place. So an autocrine, auto, what do you think that means? It gets released by the muscle, and where is it going to then be used? It's an autocrine. Still in the muscle. So we work out, my bicep releases MGF, and it turns right around and it binds right back onto receptors on my bicep. MGF, okay, because it's an autocrine, helps us drive the specificity of hypertrophy to the muscles that we're working out. Okay? To the muscles that we're working out. You work out your quads, and your biceps going to get bigger, right? And part of that is because of this autocrine nature, how these things are going to work. The big deal about MGF that's so important, okay, that again was a thing that this woman at OMRF, Sumo Dean played a role in, is MGF activates satellite cells. It activates those muscle stem cells that are going to be embedded in and around your individual muscle fibers. And we need the activation of satellite cells to repair and cause growth in those particular fibers. Okay? That's why it's so important. You can get on Amazon right now and buy IGF-1. I recommend it, but you could, right? We can go to Steel and somebody's got IGF-1. For IGF-1 to work, if you want to supplement it, I am not advocating for this, mind you. You have to inject it directly into the muscles that you're going to exercise, or it's not going to work. I can systemically infuse IGF-1 into you, and it has no effect, right? It needs to go into things, right? Google the man whose bicep exploded, and they exploded because he kept injecting stuff into his biceps, right? So that's how these things work, okay? That's how these things work. So you may ask then, is there something we can do about how we exercise that's going to maximize this hormonal response? We used to think, okay, do I have it in here? No, I think I took it out. We used to think if you read any textbook or study for any exam that's done by the National Strength and Conditioning Association, they used to say if you want to do hypertrophy training, that you need to do moderate weights and short rest periods, because there was one study from doing short rest periods that you got more growth hormone than you did otherwise. And we have recently, in the last 10 years, figured out that the growth hormone and testosterone responses to a single bout of exercise actually do not govern how much hypertrophy you get whatsoever. Okay, as long as you get some response. We do know that within an individual, the stimulus for the release of those hormones is mechanical loading, so force production. More force seems to get bigger hormone response. Stretch matters. You need to perform eccentric contractions as part of your workout, which almost everybody does, right? You pick the weight up, you lower it back down. Okay? And then total muscle mass use seems to also be helpful. You want the biggest response, use more muscle in a particular day. Okay? The big issue though is what's the issue with stretch and loading? So mechanical stress, total force production, and then the stretch from the eccentric contraction induces mechanical stress on the outer membrane of the muscle fiber. This leads not just to an increase in the hormone response, but the big thing that it does is it increases the production of receptors for those hormones on that particular muscle fiber. Okay? And that's one of the big issues. That's one of the reasons that the total hormone response is less relevant, is you can have a whole bunch, but you need the muscles themselves to make more receptors so they will respond better. Okay? And that's going to be the big issue. That making of more receptors, we call that upregulation. You upregulate receptors for testosterone, for growth hormone, and for IGF-1. Okay. And that's the big issue. So if you want your muscles to get bigger, the one thing that we know you need to do is to lift until failure. Okay? If you want to get really strong, you have to lift a heavy weight. You don't have to lift a heavy weight to get big. You do need to lift until you can't lift anymore. That seems to be the key thing. You can lift a light weight, but you better lift it until you can't do it anymore. Okay? You guys were on, remember last week on Wednesday, Ellis had some little 2-pound dumbbells that she was doing bench press with on the bed while I was teaching. If I gave you those 2-pound dumbbells, you can make your muscles hypertrophy with those 2-pound dumbbells. You just might have to do like 1,000 reps with them. Okay? You got to curl that 2 pounds until you cannot curl it anymore. And so it's much easier for us to reach failure, to reach where I cannot do any more reps using a somewhat heavier weight. But we have good evidence now. You can do sets of 20 or 30 or 50, as long as you can't do 21 or 31 or 51, and you get roughly the same amount of hypertrophy that you get from doing sets of 4 or 5 or 8 or 10 or 12, those kind of traditional resistance training. It's the end point that matters, okay? And oftentimes it's just much easier to get people to that end point. And we think it's the end point because it's that mechanical stress that's going to be there, okay? Does that make sense, guys? Does that make sense? Okay. So you can hypertrophy using any kind of set and rep range as long as you achieve failure. As long as you achieve failure. Okay. Okay. So we're going to do this. We talked about the role of satellite cells. So let me show you guys the importance of satellite cells. Okay. We do a fun thing in animals. Maybe it's not really fun. It's probably pretty terrible. Okay. You can zap cells with radiation and kill the satellite cells. So we take these muscle fibers out of, I think these are from rats, and they culture them, they grow them in a test tube, and then we zap them with radiation and we make it where the satellite cells don't work. Okay. Oh no, I apologize. This has ablation. This is in an intact rat. Okay. So we're going to give it some radiation. Then we're going to do a thing called synergist ablation, which basically means we're going to go in on these rats, and let's just say they have what's called the EDL muscle, but it's basically the equivalent of our gastrocs and our soleus. We're going to go in on the cut your 2 gastroc muscles so you can only walk and do plantar flexion using your soleus. Okay. And so by cutting those synergists, you walk around using just one of those 3 muscles. That muscle gets really, really big. It gets a lot of stress. So what you see here is the percent increase in the EDL muscle with just the ablation. It's about 20%. When I irradiate the satellite cells and then I give them the ablation, their muscle actually shrinks. Okay. And then I do just the irradiation, I make your muscle shrink. So when I kill off your satellite cells, your muscles get smaller anyway. Okay. And so we know because of things like this that having proper functioning satellite cells and having the ability to release mechano growth factor to activate those satellite cells is one of the key events in driving muscle hypertrophy. Okay? In driving muscle hypertrophy. So this is a big deal. Okay. This is a big deal. Okay. So I put this on here if only because I thought it was cool because Sue works up at OMRF now. But what they basically did was they gave the animals rapamycin to block mTOR. So they do the same experiment kind of as what you saw before on the last one, but rather than irradiating the satellite cells, we just block the ability of mTOR to be active. And what you see basically here is that when I give rapamycin, it's the gray bars, I limit the amount of hypertrophy that we see in 7 days and 14 days. You can make a rat or a mouse increase muscle size really fast. Their life cycle is much shorter than ours, so things go a lot faster. Okay, so that's why we know again that mTOR matter. Okay, satellite cells matter, activating mTOR matter. Those are the 2 really, really big ones. You have to take it away from what works from a hypertrophy standpoint. Okay. Okay. So that may raise the question, Dr. Black, how does exercise stimulate mTOR? The honest answer is we don't fucking know. We don't know. We've been working on it for 30 years. In the same way that we don't know how when you exercise, you upregulate glucose to the muscle membrane so you can actually treat your type 2 diabetes, right, by exercise. We've been working on that one for about 60 years. We'll figure it out. Somebody will win a Nobel Prize for it. But we don't really know. What we think it is, okay? What we think the big issue is something about there's a mechanoreceptor. There's something in your muscle membranes that sense that load and that stretch that we're getting when you do sort of heavy or get near failure with those concentric eccentric contractions. Okay. We think there's a mechanoreceptor that we have just not yet identified that we must activate in addition to having the release of testosterone and growth hormone, having some amino acids available to maximally activate mTOR. Okay. That's what we think is going on. So, okay. So if there are things that drive growth, there's also things that prevent growth. Okay. What you see in front of you here is a Belgian blue bull. Okay. That bull has never lifted a weight in his life. And yet, he's a big, strong dude, right? He's a big, strong guy. That bull genetically lacks something called myostatin. It's a muscle-specific protein, and it's called myostatin. Okay? Myostatin puts a limit on how big your muscles can get. It's an anti-growth factor. Okay? It's an anti-growth factor. So if you have no myostatin, you're going to be bigger than somebody that has some or a lot of myostatin. Okay? Every one of you in this room has a different baseline level of myostatin. Okay? A different baseline level of myostatin. And that's also one of the genetic things that controls how big your muscles are. Okay? You can see in this baby up here, okay? You guys remember the little rolls on Ellis's legs from the picture at the start? This kiddo doesn't have that. 7-month-olds should not have a visible vastus lateralis muscle. Okay? They shouldn't. That kiddo does. That kiddo does not have any myostatin. Okay? That kid is myostatin deficient. There are people that are myostatin deficient. Okay? They are disproportionately Olympians. Okay? They're disproportionately Olympians. If you want to have fun with Googling, Google myostatin deficient dog. Myostatin deficient mouse. Okay? The dogs will haunt your nightmares forever. Okay? But I mean, there are all sorts of animals that basically that lack myostatin, and they are all completely jacked. Okay, but there are people that are myostatin deficient. So we know then that part of what this is supposed to do is it's to help protect our muscles. You can't get too big to where you could break a bone or rip your tendons or things like that. Okay. Remind me at some point to tell you guys about the time that we broke a dude's femur when I was a PhD student. Doing isometric, we were doing electrical stimulation. The guy had a spinal cord injury, and we were doing electrical stimulation of his quads for a project, and we broke his femur. It was cool because I mean he couldn't feel it, and we were doing the exercise. We were going to put him in an MRI machine to see how much of his muscle we had activated by doing all of this. So we just put him in there, and they're like, "Yep, we were at a hospital. Yep, he broke his femur. He was fine." Right? But, you know, femur break, not fun. Kind of like a gunshot in there. Anyway, so if you got too much muscle, you can break things, okay? What we think myostatin does to limit muscle growth is it blocks satellite cell function, okay? It blocks satellite cell function. Okay. We know, because I know you guys are probably going to ask about all of this, we know that about 80% of the differences in muscle mass between individuals is due to genetics. Okay. VO2 max differences, aerobic capacity is about 40. Muscle mass is largely genetic. Okay. We have identified as of, whenever our textbook was put out last year, almost 50 different genes that play a control in regulating muscle mass. As I said, mTOR is a big one. Most of those genes, if they're not directly activating mTOR, they play a role in one of the sort of upstream or downstream signals before or after mTOR and regulating those kinds of things. Okay. We know that there are differences in the extent to which people can respond to resistance training. Some of you are high responders. Some of you are low responders. Most of us are somewhere in the middle. Okay. The fascinating question is, how does that influence athletics? If you knew right now that you had a larger or smaller capacity to make your muscles bigger, would that influence what you went and did today from an exercise standpoint? If you knew, right, there are these 47 genes, I could have that test done, and I could know today if Ellis has a large or a small or a medium capacity for hypertrophy. And is that going to influence what I'm going to try to sort of let her do as a kid in those ways, right? We're going to figure this out in y'all's life. We'll know what the genes are. There'll be a test, right? You can do your 23andMe, and instead of finding, right, all of those lost sort of relatives that you didn't know that you had. My neighbor across the street learned that he was basically a test tube baby. His parents hadn't told him that. He has 23 siblings. Yep. The sperm donor was a medical student at the Health Science Center. And that was back in the 80s when they didn't regulate some of this stuff. And so that's sperm donor, right? Because you look through the book, you're like, okay, it's this, they're healthy, they have these characteristics, they're a med student, right? Like just giving it out to everybody, right? So he has 23 brothers and sisters. Like every year at Christmas, they find a new one. Because somebody does. But we'll be able to do that. One of them, I don't know if it's 23andMe or if it's one of them, it will tell you things about like, are you at a risk of obesity? Are you at a risk of type 2 diabetes and those kinds of things, right? They're selling your when you sign that thing, they're selling that stuff off to different drug companies, by the way, as part of that. But we'll be able to know in y'all's lifetime, right? The good, the bad, all of these things. Do we want to know? Do we not want to know? I don't know. I think it's a really fascinating question. Okay. So that's what we've got. Okay. As I said, there's these different genes. Some of you guys genetically have a low potential, so you work out exactly the same as everybody else. You get almost no muscle response. Most of us are somewhere in the middle and are kind of a moderate responder. We're in that 10 to 20%. And then there's the people that get really, 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 really jacked, depending upon sort of what they do. And most of it is genetic. Right? It's mostly genetic. Okay. So that's what happens when you work out. What if you don't? What if you don't? I'll tell you guys a little story. When I was a PhD student, this was after we worked in the gas. One of the reasons that we studied individuals with spinal cord injuries because, right, they're very, very inactive. They cannot contract their muscles. And so they have tiny, tiny muscles sort of below the level of injury. Okay. It's called disuse. Okay. Disuse. So if you're on bed rest, you can get a lot of disuse atrophy. If you're sedentary, you get some, but not a huge amount. If you go into space, right, you're weightless. So you can be super active, but there's no load. There's no gravity, so you're not working against anything. Okay? So the guy that I did my PhD with previously before coming to Georgia, he worked for NASA and was one of the people that helped try to design their countermeasures for the astronauts on how we send them to space and not have their muscles shrink entirely, doing a bunch of things. Okay. And one of the ways that we did this was we studied this by having a on the ground model of spaceflight. It was an disuse sort of model. And we paid people $1,000 to hop around on one leg, basically with some crutches and a giant platform shoe, and let one leg swing free and bear no weight for a month. Okay, for a month. You guys may think $1,000, that seems pretty good, right? This was like, 2005, so I don't know, with inflation, it's probably like $1,500 now or something, okay? Every person was like, I'll never do this again, ever. Right, it was not enough. But we got in a month, okay, we got about an 18% decrease in plantar flexor, so gastroc soleus size, and about 50% decrease in quad size in a month. Okay, in a month. It takes a couple of months to get a measurable, noticeable amount of increase in size. It goes away super duper fast. Okay. So if you're on bed rest, if you've ever been in a cast, if you do anything like that, okay, you sit around in your couch potato, right? You will lose muscle really, really quickly because you lose that hormone response, you lose that mechanical load response, you lose that ability to activate mTOR and those things, and so the opposite happens. You can get this disuse atrophy really, really, really. Okay, this is a major problem. Okay, for older individuals. You go through menopause, you go through andropause, and you start losing the hormones. Then you become sedentary, and you begin to lose all this other muscle mass. You become sarcopenic, and then you can't stand, and then it gets worse. Right? You can't walk, you can't do things, you're stuck in bed, and your muscles shrink even more. Right? So moving around tells me we must be out of time. Okay. If you have test corrections, I need them. If I don't have them, I'm entering grades this afternoon. So if I don't have your test back, you're getting 0. Okay. Good deal.